Well, Andrew, it's so wonderful to see you again.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you, and I'm delighting in our emerging new friendship.
Yes, I am as well. And I really admire what you've been doing for the last number of years. But I most admire what you've been doing for the last 2 years.
Well, let's see what happened is 3.5 years ago I fell from grace and my community was decimated as a result, really of my own pride. And then I more or less disappeared for about 3 years and did a lot of work on myself, did a lot of suffered enormously. And I think really throughout the last 12 months I've begun to emerge and come out the other side. So I'm feeling very much in a renewed state, but it's been the most harrowing journey of my life. But I feel that there was a message I needed to receive, and I don't think I was going to hear that message any other way unless I fell as far and as hard as I actually did.
And what is that message that you needed to hear?
That you ain't shit. That I'd been a very arrogant man, and in shocking ways quite deluded, and being driven by unwholesome forms of ambition.
Sounds like you were human.
Well, that's what I've come to realize and come to understand. The pain and the shame and the humiliation of it all, and I think more than that, I think the suffering itself, for months on end, the grueling nature of it, the unforgiving nature of the suffering, is what compelled me or forced me to let go of a lot of deluded ideas I had and emotionally driven, unexamined emotionally driven needs. So in the end, or on the other side of most of that, I actually feel a level of gratitude that I've never felt in my life. And I feel I have a chance to do something in a very different way than I ever did, coming from a much more wholesome place than myself than was available to me in the past. So I do feel very grateful.
Much more integrated?
I think that'll be the result. It's not really how I think about it. What I feel is something. There was a kind of a dark form of ambition and pride and a need to see myself as being superior, and using other people as mirrors in which to see my own, to fulfill the needs of my own narcissistic cravings, to be brutally honest about it. So now that much of that has fallen away, I feel so much more at ease and comfortable to being simply myself. So it feels much more, it really feels so much easier simply to be who I am, without needing or wanting or hoping that other people will see me in a way that I so desperately wanted them to. So it's an enormous relief. But it's amazing how much I held on in spite of so much, and what it really took for me to let go was quite something. And but now that I'm very much on the other side of it, the primary feeling I have is gratitude and joy, and much more freedom.
Do you see the perfection of how things unfolded?
Now I do. I remember at the early stages of the collapsing of my community, I felt like the earthquake of the century was happening in, through, and around me, and it was the worst thing that ever could have happened. And a friend asked a powerfully awakened spiritual teacher that he knew to call me, to console me, to advise me, to enlighten me. And this teacher was, the minute we'd never met each other, but when we started speaking on the phone, he didn't get into anything personal with me. He understood what the situation was, but all he started saying was, isn't it the most incredible thing that's ever happened? Aren't you so grateful? Look at the opportunity God's giving you for purification. Isn't this fantastic? Isn't this wonderful? Isn't this great? And I could immediately recognize the deep and profoundly liberated place in his heart that he was speaking to me from. And I knew the place he was calling me to, because I had called many of my own students over the years to the same place, and I spoke from the same place. And I could fully recognize simultaneously that I was absolutely unable to meet him. And I heard myself in a very pathetic and embarrassing way, considering who I'd been for so long, saying, no, no, this is the worst thing that ever happened. This never should have happened. Oh no. And I was full of self-pity and so much grief, so much grief and self-pity, and wishing that it wasn't happening, which on one level, of course, was understandable, but something much deeper and more profound was happening, and I needed to really wake up that something needed to give in my own being. And I was the cause of all this. And from the highest perspective, to use mythical language, God was giving me an opportunity to purify myself, to cleanse myself, to face my sins and my arrogance. And I wasn't, during that phone call, I wasn't yet able to realize that was simply so. From a very small part of me, way back deep inside, I knew that he was right, but I was so spiritual, and I say with shock, well, but I shouldn't be. I was so spiritually unprepared to meet that moment. And so it took me really about 3 years after that phone call to get to the point in my own development where it's all true and everything he was saying was true, and it is the truth. But it took me a long time to get there.
You know, Jumpo, my teacher, was so instrumental in me not having to go through something similar for me.
Yeah.
Because my personality is very similar to yours.
In which way?
Well, it's damn the torpedoes, full speed
right.
ahead.
Well, that's how I was. That's how I was.
It's burn the boats on the beach. There's no escape. And I was trying to eliminate the deficiencies in my own personality by projecting them onto my students and eliminating them in my students, thinking I was ridding the world of it.
I'm guilty of exactly the same crime. Yeah, I did that way too often.
That's the way shadows work.
Yeah.
What we can't see in ourselves, we project into others.
Or, and tell me if you agree, or I think that there were parts of myself that I was avoiding, or that I was frightened of, or that I was in denial of. And so when some of my students would act out in certain ways that would display weaknesses that reminded me at an unconscious level of weaknesses in myself that I didn't want to face, I found it unbearable. I found it unbearable, and then I would shame them and blame them for it. But it really had nothing to do with them. It had to do with me.
And isn't that the same thing, just a little different view?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I can really relate to that. For example, when I was afraid and about ready to display a weakness, rather than doing that, rather than being open, honest, and vulnerable, I would project something onto the students in order to avoid displaying my weakness.
Yeah.
And it's just the same. It's slightly more visible, but
so the meta question in what we're talking about is, you know, we've both done a lot of spiritual work. We've both been teachers for a long time, and relatively speaking, we should be more awake than a lot of other people because of that. And in many ways, we obviously are and have been. And yet, in spite of it, we're both speaking about unexamined shadow. And this is something that Ken Wilber has spoken about with a great deal of clarity and urgency for many years. And I've also had many talks with myself about it. But in spite of how much I thought I knew and understood about the territory, there was so much about it that I was literally radically oblivious to in my own conduct and behavior and consciousness. And so part of the paradox of awakening at this time in history is, how can people who have a measure of profound spiritual awakening and enlightenment still be so unconscious to